Parents refused to pay for their daughter's college but paid for their nephews instead. Later, grandparents disinherited them because of this. I'm a 17-year-old girl, turning 18 in a few weeks, and I'm supposed to start college in 2 months. I got accepted into my top choice school about a month ago and was thrilled because they have a great microbiology program, which is what I want to study. But my excitement faded quickly when my parents told me they couldn't afford to send me there. Instead, they said I had to go to my backup school because it was closer to home and cheaper for them. We had an argument because it felt so unfair. They had always told me to apply to any college I wanted, but now, when it's time to pay, they're saying they don't have enough money. My dad is a software engineer and my mom is the head of sales at a company, so I was really shocked. We live comfortably, so I didn't understand why they were being so stingy about my education. I don't have any siblings for them to worry about, and the tuition was within their budget. It felt unfair, but they kept saying they'd go broke paying my tuition and wouldn't be able to save enough for retirement. My parents are in their early 40s, so I didn't get why they were worried about retirement already since they still have at least 20 more working years. I argued with them for several days and tried everything, getting angry, begging, and even making deals. I offered to pay them back in full if they funded my education at my top choice school, so they wouldn't lose any money. They didn't care and told me to look into student loans instead of wasting time arguing, or just go to my backup school. I didn't want to take a loan because of the risk involved. After a week of arguing, I realized my parents were set on not giving me the money for some reason, and continuing to fight was pointless. I had 2 choices: go to my backup school and give up on my dream college, or take out a loan and end up with a lot of debt like so many others. Both options seemed terrible to me. I kept researching loans and their pros and cons and applied for a scholarship. I didn't lose hope, but I did stop talking to my parents after our fight. They were being selfish and I couldn't forgive them. My relationship with my parents has always been strained. Both of them worked a lot and often brought their work home. My grandparents, my dad's parents, were the ones who took care of me most of the time when I was little. When I got old enough to stay home alone, my parents would leave me by myself for hours while they were at work. Even when they were home, they didn't show much interest in me. They'd talk to me at meals sometimes and ask about school and my friends, but it was clear they weren't really interested, so I didn't try to talk to them either. It just felt pointless. To be blunt, my parents were just people who paid for what I needed and let me live with them. It sounds harsh and makes me seem like a selfish brat, but you can't blame me because my parents never really tried to form an emotional bond with me. As a kid, I tried to get their attention and win them over, but never could, so I eventually gave up. As long as I had a roof over my head, clothes to wear, and food to eat, I was fine. They sent me to a decent school, I got good grades, and now I wanted to go to a reputable college to get a well-paying job. They were supposed to pay for it because they had the money, and that's how it had always been. I didn't expect my parents to shower me with love and affection or tell me they were proud of my achievements, but I did expect them to fund my education because that was the one area where they hadn't let me down yet. Unfortunately, now they had failed as parents even in that aspect. I'm not saying this just because they refused to pay for my education. About 2 weeks ago, I found out they were paying for my cousin's education instead. My dad has an older brother with a son the same age as me. He's starting college around the same time. We have a few mutual friends, and one of them sent me a picture my cousin had posted. It was a photo of my parents, smiling broadly while hugging him. In the caption, he thanked my parents for sponsoring his education and encouraging him to chase his dreams. My cousin had probably blocked me at my parents' request since I couldn't see his profile at all. I hadn't even noticed because we weren't close. My friend, unaware of my situation, sent the screenshot to tell me how kind and generous my parents were. She had no clue that they were putting their own daughter's dreams and ambitions aside to support someone else's. On one hand, my parents claimed they couldn't afford to send me to the college of my choice, but they had no issues sponsoring my cousin's education, even though his college was more expensive than mine. What they told me just didn't add up. It also didn't make sense that his father wasn't paying for his tuition. My uncle is a high school teacher at a private school and seems to make enough money to support his son. Judging by their house, they don't live poorly, and I'm sure they can afford it if they want to. His mom isn't in the picture anymore, but they co-parent, and she's a journalist, so it's definitely not about the money for them. When I found out, my parents weren't home, as usual. I wanted to confront them, but I was so angry that I decided to go to my grandparents first. I have a good relationship with them, but I hadn't told them anything about what I was going through because my grandma was kind of sick, and I didn't want to burden them. They were reasonably well off and had retired a couple of years ago after handing over their textile business to my great-uncle. The 3 of them had run the business together, but my grandparents chose to retire once they turned 60. My great uncle, still in his mid-50s, had no intention of retiring anytime soon since he had no family and enjoyed working and traveling. They all still earned well from the business, but my parents had never relied on them for money and taught me not to take money from them either. I never needed to anyway, so I didn't question it. My grandparents had always been very kind to me, making me feel loved, which was a nice change from the treatment I got at my parents' place. I used to visit them frequently. Unfortunately, about a year ago, my grandmother was diagnosed with Parkinson's, making it hard for her to do the things she used to do. I stopped visiting as much because I didn't want to be a burden on them. This time, I couldn't just sit back and accept this unfair treatment from my parents and cousin. It was clear they had teamed up against me for some reason, sabotaging my chances of going to the college I wanted. I couldn't let that happen. Within an hour of finding out, I headed to my grandparents' place. They welcomed me warmly. I hadn't visited them for almost 2 months, and seeing them again made me regret not keeping in touch. They looked like they missed having me around and were thrilled to see me, which was reassuring. Without wasting much time, I told them what I had discovered. As I talked, I could feel the anger building because it was all so unfair. My cousin's grades weren't even as good as mine, yet my parents chose to sponsor him over their own daughter and tried to cover it up. If it hadn't been for that one friend, I might never have found out about their lies, and they would have been completely fine with it. After I finished telling my grandparents what happened, I started crying, and they comforted me. They looked serious and told me to go home, pack my things, and come back. I was confused by their instructions, but I was tired of living in a house where my parents and I wouldn't talk to each other. So I agreed without saying anything else. Before, my parents would at least try to talk to me, even if it was just small talk. But now it was like we were invisible to each other, which felt terrible. I went back home, packed my stuff, and returned to my grandparents' place. They told me they would take care of my tuition and that I didn't need to worry. I didn't understand what they had done at the time, but I was relieved that they found a way to cover the expenses. I would have been devastated if I couldn't go to the college I wanted. I was concerned about my grandparents' finances because they were both retired, and with my grandmother needing frequent medical checkups, the bills were likely to be high. I didn't want to burden them, so I offered to work to cover half of my expenses. But they brushed it off, assuring me they had enough money and that I shouldn't worry. I wondered how they would manage to pay for everything on a retired income, but I didn't want to pry, so I didn't ask. I hadn't told my parents anything before I left, so I expected to hear from them once they realized I wasn't at home. True to my expectations, they reached out to me a little after dinner time when they got back from work. I'll be honest, I hoped my parents would be upset with me for leaving without telling them anything. I wanted them to worry about me, and yes, it might sound petty, but I wanted their concern. I wanted them to call me so I could finally confront them about how they'd been terrible parents. I wanted them to feel sorry for what they'd done, but none of that happened. Instead of a worried phone call, I received a text from them, saying how disappointed they were in me and that they never wanted to see or talk to me again. Those were the first lines, and it caught me off guard because I hadn't expected it at all. It only got worse as I read on. It turns out, my uncle had lost his teaching job a couple of weeks ago for insubordination. They didn't say much more about it, but I imagine it must have been a big deal for him to get fired, considering how qualified he was. His ex-wife is getting remarried soon, so she couldn't cover the cost of their son's college tuition either. With all the bills and household expenses, my uncle just couldn't afford to send my cousin to the college he wanted to attend. When my cousin found out, he was really upset and even threatened to run away from home. That's when my parents stepped in and offered to sponsor him. He planned to major in art, which was a riskier investment for my uncle because it's often harder to repay such loans after graduation. I'm not criticizing art majors, I'm just being realistic. That's why my father believed it would be better for them to pay for his education instead. They explained that they chose to sponsor him over me because he needed it more, whereas I could still manage with loans and other options. I don't know how much of that was true, but that's what they told me. They texted me to let me know that my grandparents had called them earlier that day, presumably when I left to collect my things. My grandparents told my parents they were cutting all of them out of their will and leaving everything to me instead. My parents were furious that I had told my grandparents about their actions instead of discussing it with them first. I guess that might be a fair point. I'm not sure if they're right, but I still think what they did was messed up. I understand they were concerned for my cousin, but even then, I should have been their first choice, not him. That hurt me, and I think anyone in my position would feel the same way. When I received the text from my parents, I didn't respond because I didn't know what they expected me to say. I believe they wanted me to apologize to them and my cousin and then stop my grandparents from changing their will. But I didn't think that would be fair to me at all because, if anything, I was the one who had been wronged by them, not the other way around. It's been a week since I got that message, and I still haven't heard from anyone in my family. Living with my grandparents is more pleasant than with my parents, but that text keeps bothering me. I feel like I might have messed things up for everyone. Yes, I could have taken out student loans, but so could my cousin. Yet I was expected to, just because he acted immaturely by threatening to run away from home. I always knew my cousin could be bratty and annoying when things didn't go his way, but I thought he'd grown out of it. Unfortunately, he hasn't, and now I'm dealing with the fallout. I don't know if I should talk to my grandparents about the inheritance issue because it's their decision. On one hand, I don't need all that money, and my parents and uncle might need it in the future. I feel like I'm hoarding it and being unfair to them by keeping it all to myself. Maybe I should have at least talked to my parents about it. Update 1. First off, I want to thank everyone who commented on my original post. It really means a lot to me. It seems that strangers on the internet are showing more kindness than my own family, which is pretty amazing. I also want to address some criticism I received about how I view my parents. Some people said it seemed like I only see them as a source of money and nothing else. But that's how it feels sometimes. They've always been busy with work, leaving me alone at home for hours. We never had a strong emotional connection, so naturally I see them as my financial support. But deep down, I still hope they care about me and worry about me like any parent should. Despite everything, I still crave affection and validation from them, like any kid would. My childhood has been complicated, and I don't expect everyone to understand, but I hope people can be more understanding and less judgmental. Anyway, I decided not to talk to my parents again and even blocked them after discussing their text with my grandparents. I just couldn't keep it in any longer and told my grandparents everything, as many of you advised. They said it was ridiculous for my parents to expect me to be okay with them paying for my cousin's education, regardless of the reason. If my uncle needed money, he should have gone to his parents, not his brother. Both my dad and his brother have very high egos and refuse to accept any money from my grandparents. My grandpa thinks it's because they had to live very frugally while growing up, as the family business was just starting out and not making much money. My dad and uncle couldn't afford the kind of life their friends had, which made them resent my grandparents. They believe that if my grandparents had kept their regular jobs instead of starting their own business, they wouldn't have had to give up any luxuries. My grandma believes the real reason my dad and uncle are so uptight about borrowing money is that they are too proud and arrogant to admit they need help. They would rather suffer and make their kids suffer than ask their parents for money. Both theories are plausible, and it's not like my grandparents would have said no if their sons had ever asked for help. My grandparents still make decent money from their business, which is running well now. They can afford to stay home and relax while my great-uncle handles everything at work. Their business is doing well and will continue to do so. The bottom line is that there was no real excuse for my parents to choose my cousin over me. Update 2. It's been almost 2 weeks since I moved out of my parents' house. Today, my parents finally showed up at my grandparents' place, demanding that I come back with them. I immediately said no and told them I didn't want to go back at all. They refused to listen and threatened to call the cops and have my grandparents arrested for abduction if they didn't let me leave with them. That made me lose it completely, and I started screaming at them about how they should be arrested for neglecting me my entire childhood. I told them they had put their own brotherhood above me and couldn't be bothered to think about me, all because they felt my cousin's threat to run away justified what they did to me. Yelling at my parents made me feel much lighter, as if years of anger, bitterness, pain, and resentment were finally leaving my body. My mother started crying at some point, but they didn't leave and waited for me to stop yelling. My dad then told me he was very disappointed in how I turned out and wished he hadn't come to take me back and make things right. When I asked for an explanation, he said he had planned to connect me with a friend who worked at a bank to help me get a loan for my tuition. This was his idea of making amends, instead of giving me my college fund, which was rightfully mine. I was so furious that I felt like pushing my parents out of the house. I couldn't believe he thought connecting me with a banker would make everything okay. I felt another wave of anger coming on, but thankfully my grandparents stepped in and asked my parents to leave and not come back. I'll be 18 in a couple of weeks, so I won't need their consent to live where I want. Even if I weren't 18, I'd rather go to prison than live with my parents. Their emotional unavailability and arrogance almost ruined my life once. I'm not letting it happen again. They're gone now, and to make sure they can't take legal action against my grandparents for letting me stay here, we're talking to an attorney. My grandparents even apologized for not taking me away from my irresponsible parents when I was a kid, but I don't blame them. I'm disappointed in my parents, but I'm not surprised. This was always going to happen, it was just a matter of when. They've let me down countless times, but now I'm not letting them do this to me anymore. We're done, and I'm finally going to be free from them. Update 3. I just experienced my first day of college, and it was amazing. My parents are no longer in the picture, so it's just my grandparents, a couple of friends, and you guys who get to hear about it. At least until I make some new friends. I hope the next couple of months go as well as today did. My grandparents are very proud of me, and I'm so thankful to have such an amazing support system.